Alright, so this is my initial AstroTurf setup for the Schumacher CAT 3000, running a silver can, to me a torque-tuned motor. It's important to point out that I'm running a torque-tuned motor because that's not a particularly fast motor, and so if you were to put like a really fast motor in this car, the optimal setup on the same type of surface and track would change because your corner speeds are going to be higher. Likewise also for my YZ10 video that I just made as well. Anyway, getting to it. What do I have here? Well, a few things. Nothing too crazy. No custom parts or anything like that. But it's a baseline CAT 3000 with front and rear sway bars. So I do have the front and rear sway bar kits. Those make a huge difference to keep the car from rolling, especially on turf. As for the suspension geometry adjustments, so what do we have here? On the front tower, the lower inner hole for the inner camber link. This will increase the roll center and reduce the camber gain. I want a longer link here because this has very aggressive steering. So a longer link will calm that down a little bit. And there's other things I need to do to calm it down further. I'll get to that briefly. Let's see, on the outer camber link here, this is just let's say standard. You just have a ball stud with, I think it's like a 2mm spacer between the ball stud and the caster block. This might be part of a shoulder sleeve that inserts into the caster block. I don't quite remember, but this would be, I believe, your standard ball stud placement here. Before I get to the shocks, I'll just go to the rear and show also for the rear I use the lower inner hole as well. Again, try to calm the car down using the inner camber link hole. If I use the outer hole, you'd have more rear camber gain, which would help the car rotate more, and I have more than enough rotation on this car even as it is. So I use the inner hole here. On the rear hub carrier, you can see on either side here, I'm using what should be the middle hole. This has 3 holes for the rear hub carrier, and I'm on the middle hole there. Let's see, what else? For the actual hub carrier placement, I think there are spacers here, if I remember correctly. Yes, there are. Hold on a second, let me just flip this over. So you see there's little white spacers on either side. I just have the hub carrier smack dab in the middle. Okay. And then for the shocks, so for the rear shocks, I'm using the outer hole on the arms and the inner hole on the tower. So very similar to what I did on the YZ10. And then for the front shocks, I'm using the outer hole on the arms and the topmost hole on the tower. So if I flip this around, you can see that the front shock tower has a row of 3 holes here along a diagonal, and then you go up one, and then there's a row of 2 holes here. So I'm just on the topmost hole here. The reason for that was to help me drop the front ride height. If you start off at the middle hole, so if you go from this hole one down, the ride height's too tall, and it still jumps perfectly fine with the shock pulled up and the arm pulled up to the topmost hole here. You still get plenty of ground clearance for jumping. Black front springs, these are the stiffest springs that Schumacher had on offer for these older style shocks. And red springs in the rear, I think that's like a middle tension for the rear. Let me see what I have here for oil and pistons. So 35 weight all around, front and rear oil, so slightly lighter oil than what I ran on the YZ10. These are the variable piston shocks. So you basically have, within the shock piston, it's a 2-piece unit that you can click to different piston settings. So you can have 1 hole open, 2, 3, or 4 open holes in the piston. So on the front, I set it to 2 hole, and on the rear, I set it to 3 hole. And what else we got going on here? What other subtle things did I do? So we'll talk a bit about what I need to do next after first talking about the tires. So slightly different tire choice here than what I have for the YZ10, which I ran on the same day today. In the rear I have Schumacher Mezzo's yellow compound. Okay, so these are about the same grip as mini darts, give or take a bit. And on the front I have Schumacher Cactus Fusion front tires, but they're blue instead of yellow. Okay, these are yellow. And I did that to have a slightly more slippery front tire to try to scrub off cornering grip, to try to numb the car down a bit. Very, very aggressive on turn-in. The other thing that I think would help that I haven't done yet is to reduce the front Ackerman. So as it stands, the way that this steering rack is set up, there are no adjustments on the steering rack side for you to change the Ackerman. The way the drag link mounts on the steering pieces between this left part of the bell crank and the right part, there's just one hole that it mounts there. On some other racks, like on the Losi XX4, for example, you have 2 hole options on each of the left and right halves of your bell crank. This just has one hole. So on the XX4, if you want to change the Ackerman, you can do it on the steering rack. Here, it's actually on the steering block. So next time I take this car out, I would want to take this ball stud and move it to the rearmost hole, which would reduce Ackerman. And what that means is when you corner, reduced Ackerman would mean at full steering lock, your inside wheel won't turn in as much. It'll point a little bit more straight, and that will help reduce turn-in, because on initial turn-in you don't have weight transfer yet left to right because the car is just turning in, and that means that you have more or less equal contribution from the inner and outside tire for total cornering. And so the inside tire, if it points in more, it's going to give you more turn-in. Reducing Ackerman will help to numb that out. So that's probably one thing that'll help a whole lot to numb this down, because as it is, even with the blue front Cactus Fusions, and with my steering dual rate set to 80%, and my steering expo set to minus 60%, it's still very aggressive on turn-in. So it's a bit lively. And so you have to really calm your nerves when you're driving this car around a turf track. Okay, what did I do for the electronics setup? Ignore my wiring. I know I tend to run messy wiring. So I have, okay, on this side, Novak Tempest speed control. I love the Tempest. It's my favorite DC speed control. Receiver up here, fan over here. I use a longer screw. Actually, why did I turn this car around? I just turn it back around this way. A longer screw than what you would normally use to mount the upper deck to the motor mount, so I could basically lock this fan down right above the motor. The thing is, although I really should rotate this out more to blow more air down into this ventilation hole, the problem is that when you mount the body, the way the body's contoured, it doesn't give you a whole lot of room to push this fan further out. Although, when I cut this body, I intentionally left me extra margin here. Normally you would cut along this line. I actually cut way down here so I can mount the body a bit higher up. With the previous body I was using, which is just the body that came with this car, was already painted, I had to push that body lower down because it was cut along the normal or correct cut line. So what I might be able to do actually here is to take this and rotate it out more, because that body mounts higher. The reason why that body mounts higher is because of what's going on the battery side. I couldn't get any saddle lipo trays for this. They are, at least the ones from Mazoom, the 3D printed ones, are not in stock right now. So I had to come up with a different solution. So I tried to do a shorty lipo mount. And this was actually very difficult because there's only just barely enough room to do this. This particular tray is maybe also not quite the best tray to do it with, because it's kind of a thick tray and it has some overhang here from these screw posts. But nonetheless, I made it work, and I did have to drill a hole through the chassis to secure this battery tray down. This has like a little ear with a hole on it that you screw down through. So I just drilled a hole from the bottom of the chassis and tapered that hole so I could put a flathead screw up through with a lock nut, and that holds it down. I did try to put some servo tape underneath this battery tray to help secure it on the rear side as well, like in the middle toward the rear, so that this wasn't the only thing holding the battery tray down. But it seems like that servo tape gave out and this is lifting. So I'm going to have to find a way to really secure this better. Maybe just better tape or some glue or something. But this is so tight that this isn't really going to move a whole lot, so that's good. But there's just barely enough clearance between the inside of this and the center belt. And as you can see here also, the inner surface of the cup and this lock nut here for this pulley on the motor mount just barely fits. And even as you do that, you just barely have clearance to the rear inner arm mount here. And this has to mount at something of a diagonal so that this side here can clear this nut, and that pushes this corner out ever so slightly. So I actually have to cut an opening in the under tray just to accommodate that outward push. Now what this does, especially, well, this is part of the problem. The other problem is this here. This protrudes out a little bit, and if you just have this body cut normally, then you're going to have a real hard time wrapping the body around this side. It's going to get really mucky, let's say. So if I cut the body a little taller, it just gives me more height margin to be able to mount the body and not have any issues with this extra space that's needed to accommodate the shorty battery that goes in here. Maybe there's a better solution. You know, especially if you're not running like a 4.2 amp hour shorty. If you're running something that's smaller, like a thin shorty, then you can take this whole stack and drop it down. That'll maybe work a little better. But this is what I have right now, and it seems to work okay. Let's see. For gearing, what do I have? A 22 tooth pinion and a 92 tooth spur gear for this torque tuned motor. If I went to a sport-tuned motor, I'd probably keep the same gearing for the time being, I guess. I don't see much of a difference in need for gearing between those two motors. What else we got here? Nothing really comes to mind. You know, I did play a little bit with the preload to get the right ride heights front and rear. As it is, the jumping window for this is better than what it is for the YZ10 on the same track layout and the same track surface. This seems to be a lighter car, so it accelerates a bit harder. The belt drive on this seems to be a bit more efficient, less draggy. It's certainly quieter than what it was on the YZ10. That could be related to the belts, it could be related to the gear mesh, I'm not completely sure. But this does seem to spin a little bit freer than what I currently have on my YZ10 setup. And it drives nice, jumps nice, it's just very aggressive on steering. So if I can solve that problem, this thing will be a real weapon on the track on AstroTurf. I like this a lot more than I thought I would. So it's a fun car. Let's see. Is there anything else to mention here? Cover the battery, the electronics. Yeah, no, that's kind of it. So hopefully this helps you if you happen to have a Schumacher CAT 3000 and you're running it on turf. These are the setup choices that I made. The only other thing, again, just watch out for the Ackerman. You might want to take this ball stud and move it to the rearmost hole here. That'll probably help out quite a bit. Yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.